Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Many of us think that we knew and understood Atal Bihari Vajpayee, but did we? A book that's been recently published reveals details of his life, his character and his personality which not only were never known, but couldn't even have been guessed at. The book also exposes myths that most of us have so far taken as gospel truth. Here is the book. It's called Vajpayee, The Ascent of the Hindu Right, 1924 to 1977, and it's the first part of a two-part series. The second volume comes out in December. Joining me now to talk about the new image of Vajpayee that he conveys in the book is its author, Abhishek Chaudhary. Abhishek Chaudhary, let's start with the aspect of Vajpayee's life that is never spoken in public and has never been written about. And yet you've done it very honestly and very forthrightly. I'm talking about the woman in his life, Rajkumari Kaul, who was married, in fact, to the warden of the boys' hostel in Ramjas College in Delhi.
Right.
Now, before we discuss the relationship between Vajpayee and Rajkumari Kaul, let me ask you, why did you decide it was important to include this in your book? After all, a few people do know about that relationship, but they've deliberately hidden and suppressed it. You, on the other hand, have been very upfront and you've written about it. Why did you decide it was important to write about it?
First of all, Karan, thank you for having me and for that very generous endorsement of the book. Well, I think they were lifelong partners and they had a daughter. And when Mr. Vajpayee passed away in front of, it was broadcast on national television and the daughter lit the funeral pyre. So, not writing about his private life would be a criminal omission for any honest or serious biographer. Having said that, I have written about it it's only 4 or 5 pages of a 400 manuscript. Even between the two volumes, it's not more than 10 pages. But I thought it is very, very important because if you do not mention it in a very blunt, very honest way, one lie would lead to other lies because the family was also intimately involved when Mr. Vajpayee was in office. So if there was the only way I could write about it. I thought there was no other way I could write about it than be very blunt, be very honest, but also very detached, very unsentimental, very unjudgmental, and very, very unsensational. The last part is very crucial. I tried to write about it in a way that was not salacious. I did not want to introduce gossip. But there's one more thing that I had in mind. I have always thought of my book as an emotional and psychological exploration of the inner lives of the Hindu right, about which we do not know much, and there's a lot of gossip, a lot of hypocrisy going around it. I thought writing it in a way like this would introduce an element of broad-mindedness. It would tell readers, it would convey that it's okay that popular politicians can have complex private lives, and it's perfectly okay to have a complex private life.
So what you're saying is that an honest biography needs to touch upon all aspects of the person's life. You mustn't hide it.
Yes, most certainly, most definitely. Yes.
So honesty required that you write about his private life, his relationship with Rajkumari Kaul, the love child that they had. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, against that background, let's then discuss the relationship between Vajpayee and Rajkumari Kaul. Of Rajkumari Kaul, you write, she was attractive, affable, kind and articulate. And you add, unlike women in Vajpayee's extended family, she spoke excellent English. Tell me, was that the attraction? Was that what drew him to her?
Yes, that is part of the answer, and of course, the other part of the answer is that what we now call, and you see it on the arranged marriages website, that she was a great mix of tradition and modernity, and she was also like Vajpayee, even though they were not lovers during college, as is the myth. They both grew up in grew up in Gwalior of the 1940s, and in that sense they had many common acquaintances, and even at Victoria colleges they knew many, there were so many common faculty members that they knew. And most of all, I think, see, Gwalior of the 1940s was a self-contained Hindutva republic, self-sufficient Hindutva republic. It has its own way of life, and after it merged in the Indian Union, I think the families of Scindia employees continued to be nostalgic about it. So, there was that bonding.
It was natural that Vajpayee and Rajkumari Kaul would become close to each other.
In some way, yes, but only in the 50s after Vajpayee succeeded. And they were from very different social classes, Karan. So they could not have got married or even have an affair in the 40s, I think.
The easier atmosphere of the 50s made it possible for them to have an affair.
No, Vajpayee's success, I think, part of the fact that he succeeded, he became a celebrity.
And was she attracted by his success?
Some of it was, yes, of course.
Now you say of Vajpayee, and I'm quoting you, Vajpayee was emotionally a lonely, desolate man-child.
Right.
Is it then the case that he required and needed the love and affection she gave him?
Yes. I mean, I'll have to give a background to this. One of the first things that I discovered in the archives, surprisingly, was the death of his parents, the very tragic death of his parents in quick succession from cancer of both his parents in 1955. Family was struggling financially. They could not afford treatment. And melodramatically, his father was admitted, his cancer was diagnosed only a few weeks after he lost his election in February in Lucknow. His father got admitted in Lucknow hospital and he died suddenly a few weeks later. So, I had read in some of his previous profiles when he was in office that, his father's death was the worst moment of his life. And suddenly when I came upon in the archives that I gathered more details about, he never talked about it in public, which is why people don't.
But Rajkumari Kaul, in a sense, filled a gap in a vacuum.
Yes, that's what I'm coming to, that because he was, there was a lot of trauma when something like this happens, but he was constantly on the road in the 50s, and it was only after he succeeded in 57 and had a more stable life, he had a house, he had a salary, that he could think about that he had the time to think about his emotional life. And it was exactly at that moment that she came, and he didn't have much of a family because the family was kind of broken.
So she came at a time when he needed emotional comfort,
yes,
but he was also becoming successful.
Yes.
And the moment was just right for them to have a love affair.
In some ways, yes.
Now, you also confirm in your book that they had a child out of wedlock. In August 1960, a girl called Namita, whose nickname was Gunnu. You write, and I'm quoting you, as she grew older, Gunnu's facial features began to resemble her father's, but on paper, she was to be the warden's daughter.
Right.
Vajpayee may have felt the void of not being able to officially call himself a father, though Gunnu began calling him Baapji.
Right.
If I'm right, theirs was a very close, loving relationship, and when Vajpayee got a stroke in 2006, Gunnu and her husband took exceedingly good care of him.
Right, they did. I mean, she was the daughter and Ranjan was the son-in-law. So, I mean, in India, people generally do take good care of their parents, and he was a celebrity parent. So,
except that he always called her his foster daughter. Never in public did he acknowledge that she was his real biological child.
Of course, but because it would lead to unnecessary controversy. And now that since you are interested in discussing his private life in great details, I must tell you something. I tried getting in touch with the family during 2016-19 while I was researching. One by one, I approached everyone. I approached Namita Kaul Bhattacharya, the daughter, Ranjan Bhattacharya, the son-in-law, but also Nandita Nanda, who is the daughter of Kaul Sahib, but also
Rajkumari.
Yes, and Namita's elder sister. But one half sister, yes, of course. So yeah, I mean, Namita said, I'll ask my husband, and Jingtari se Milo, who was the private secretary. Ranjan's answer was very amusing. I don't remember the exact call, but I remember the 5 words that he said. He said, I'll have to check with quote unquote Narendra Bhai and Mr. Shah. And I was so amused and shocked that I couldn't tell him that, look, I'm an obscure guy trying to wrap up and...
But he actually said, I'll have to check with Narendra Bhai and Mr. Shah.
Yes.
Did he mean it or was he joking?
I don't know. Maybe it may have been his way of shooing away, somebody like me. But but also
he may have been trying to frighten you off.
possibly, but it is also true that given how things are at the moment, it is possible because PMO kind of does monitor everything very, very closely.
And did any of them talk to you?
Not these three. I mean, I tried at one occasion. I also requested my mentor, Dr. Ram Guha, he asked Veer Sangvi, who got in touch, who requested them, but nothing came of it. So, what helped in my case?
Multiple attempts were made to contact
Yes.
Namita, Ranjan and her elder half-sister Nandita,
Yes.
but none of them would talk.
Yes. I tried 5-6 times.
Who did you talk to?
I talked to, so two things. I talked to everybody else. Like gay tallies in, Frank Sinatra has a cold. When Frank Sinatra doesn't talk, he circles him.
But who is everyone else?
Oh, but everyone else is so I had a huge advantage in that I studied at Ramjas. So it just so happened, I found out that some people who had taught me were called Sahab's prodigies. And also some of the faculty members I knew back then. And then I got in touch with a few other people. So a dozen odd people at Ramjas. And then other family members and friends who, requested.
Vajpayee family members?
Yes. And friends. And in some cases, adversaries too.
Can you name the family members and friends?
Though they do not want to be named. I wish I could name, but it would make them, they specifically said we talk only if you don't name us.
But were they open? Were they acknowledging of the relationship?
Yes, not initially, but that's the difference, Karan, between journalism and biography. You have to approach people again and again, and until you develop trust, they won't tell you anything of value. If you or I had an affair in our family, would you be willing to tell me?
But after they developed trust with you, were they open enough?
Yes, there was a moment when they began to flip, and I could see that then they confided, and then what they said was really, then all of it made sense.
So then, once they'd won your trust, or you'd won their trust,
yes,
they were open and they acknowledged and accepted
yes,
that A, there was an adulterous relationship,
yes,
and B, there was a love child.
Yes. Of course, look, that is the fact, but they also loved all three of them. So nobody, they all had separate fan clubs, and everybody I talked to actually loved all of them.
But they were open about talking about it.
So many of them, yes. Some of them themselves did not know. Look, even some people in Ramjas did not know whether Namita was Kaul Sahab's daughter or Vajpayee's daughter. So there was an ambiguity, I can say deliberate ambiguity, in that.
Now, of Rajkumari Kaul and Vajpayee's relationship, this is what you write. Rajkumari's embarrassed family tried convincing her to save her marriage by letting go of the new man in her life. She refused. Yet there are no clear answers as to why she did not divorce her husband and formally marry Vajpayee. What do you think is the best explanation?
Look, Karan, I have written about it only in a paragraph. And again, I have written very cautiously, very carefully, because I do not know the entire truth. But based on what I was told, some of it was because the elder daughter, Nandita, was turning adolescent, and they thought it would emotionally be difficult for her to process. Also, Vajpayee came from a rather very conservative party, a rising party. Jan Sangh then was, we don't think of it that way, but Jan Sangh, mind you, was bigger than Aam Aadmi Party of today. We don't think of Jan Sangh of 60s that way. So, and it was on a rise for sure. So, they thought maybe, and Jan Sangh was always preached the sanctity of family life. So, they thought it might be controversial if somebody writes about it, and it might make things awkward and clumsy. But these are, again, I must add the caveat that these are only the explanations that I was told. I do not know the entire truth, and it would be dishonest on my part to speculate.
But the interesting thing is that her family members were embarrassed, and they tried to convince her to give up Vajpayee and go back and be a normal, loyal wife to Mr. Kaul.
Most Indian households would do that, I would say.
And the other thing that's important is she was concerned about the impact on her elder daughter, the daughter she had from Mr. Kaul, Nandita.
Right.
And Vajpayee was concerned about the impact on his party.
I do not, as I said, I do not know the entire truth.
But that's what people said to you.
Yes.
The intriguing thing is that as a result of them not divorcing, they actually ended up for many years, I'm talking about Vajpayee, Rajkumari Kaul and Mr. Birjan Kaul, they actually ended up for many years living as a threesome. You write, with time, the trio arrived at an equilibrium of sorts.
Right.
Rajkumari made genuine efforts to balance her care between the husband and the lover. As I read that bit, I said to myself, surely the credit actually goes to Mr. Kaul, who not only accepted his wife's adultery, but he also accepted her love child as his own daughter. Because Namita was officially brought up as a Kaul.
Right. That's right.
So surely a lot of the credit goes to the large-heartedness of Mr. Kaul.
Yes. In some ways, yes. In some ways, yes, Karan.
He was a very understanding person. Most husbands, most men,
Yes.
would be appalled that their wife has had an adulterous relationship. They'd be heartbroken that she's had a child out of wedlock from another man. But they would never consider bringing up that child as their own and presenting a facade to the world of honesty, hiding the deception that lies behind it.
Right. I mean, he got over the early hurt and shock, and with time, he made peace with that, I would say.
In a sense, it was an internal peace he made with himself.
Well, I wouldn't say that internal peace. I mean, I write about it in details in the second volume that towards the end of his life, for some reason, he decided not to live in India. He went to the US to live with his daughter. And actually, that's where he died in 96.
So at the end of his life, and this comes in part 2 and it's not in
Right.
part 1.
Right. But he was very happy there. He would tell, people would call him up and say, take pity ki, aap marne samay mein, aap videsh mein hai, and in a land you do not know too many people. And he would say, nahi yaar, mujhe maza aa raha hai, main bahut khush hu yahan pe.
Absolutely. He actually found a way of escaping from the trauma, the emotional trauma of having to live with a wife who was actually living with another man and acknowledging a daughter who's not really his daughter but the other man's daughter, because that's a traumatic thing for someone to go through. And he found an escape from it and went and lived with his own genuine daughter, Nandita, in America.
Possibly. I just said I do not know the entire truth.
But that's your hunch.
Yes.
You also hinted something.
I mean, he also benefited from the association. Look, his popularity grew in due, and he had a massive fan club. And I till this date, when I talk to people, they are bigger fans of, mind you, Mr. Kaul, Professor Kaul than Vajpayee. They would say कि नहीं उन्होंने तो उसको civilize किया, वो तो खूंखार था, आदमी था, वो तो जनसंगी था, वो गंवार आदमी था. That's how they talk. Like Kaul Sahib's protege. They have a lot of respect for him. He said, had Kaul Sahib wanted, he would have become a Rajya Sabha MP. We would joke कि हमें आप Rajya Sabha MP.
Why was this the case? Why do people that you've spoken to in Ramjas have greater respect for Kaul Sahib than for Vajpayee, who went on to become Prime Minister?
I don't know.
That's a mystery.
Yes, but they certainly loved the Kauls more than they love Vajpayee.
You also hinted something else in your book. You write, and I'm quoting you, some Rajas alumni close to him speculated that Kaul Sahib might have an alternate sexual orientation. Be explicit. Were they speculating that he was homosexual?
Well, I have quite simply reported the contemporaneous speculation, Karan. But I mean, that may have been because the first daughter was born soon after marriage, and then they didn't have a child for 10 years, and Gunnu was born after 11 years. So that may have been the cause of the rumor, but I must add rather very carefully that this was only a rumor, a speculation, and I do not know the truth, and I would not speak about it.
But it's a rumor that you thought credible enough to include in your book. Otherwise, if it was false, you wouldn't have included it.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, that I was told this by multiple people.
Multiple people?
Yes.
And so the hint here, when you say that they told you he has an alternate sexual orientation, is that he was homosexual and therefore not necessarily interested in sexual relations with his wife, and therefore not that upset that she was having sexual relations with Vajpayee. That's the suggestion.
I wouldn't say, as I said, I do not know enough about this, Karan. So it would be like rather very unfair and dishonest on my part to talk about it in details, honestly.
Absolutely, that I understand. But you did put it in your book.
I have just mentioned it in a line, Karan. And I just reported the speculation, the prevailing speculation, because some people mentioned it. And that's why it's just a line, and I put it very cautiously.
Now, eventually, when Mr. Kaul ceased to be the warden of the boys' hostel of Ramjas College, the Kauls went and lived with Mr. Vajpayee in his home. And they stayed there a long time. Rajkumari Kaul was staying with Vajpayee in what was then 7 Loknaik Mark when he was the Prime Minister. She stayed with Vajpayee till she died. Was Vajpayee at all concerned about what his party or his government or the country would think? Or did he not care?
Well, look, it's a matter of 4 decades. That's a very long time. Yes, I'm sure initially there was some grumbling inside Janasangh in the 70s. And of course, I mean, nobody likes their private life to be dissected in public. But I can tell you what really matters. It did not change fundamentally his relationship with either elders in Janasangh or the elders in Sangh Parivar. So that did not happen for sure. Yes, there were serious differences between Mr. Vajpayee and Sangh Parivar in the late 70s and early 80s. There were political differences, and that led to some kind of whisper campaign in the mid 80s and late 80s
about his personal life.
Yes, inside the RSS.
Tell me, when he was leader of the opposition, when he was foreign minister in the Janata government, and then when he was prime minister, Did he feel vulnerable because of his private life? I know that the Indian press was always respectful and never revealed it. Many journalists knew the truth but deliberately didn't print it. But it only required one paper to do it, and he could have been in fairly difficult waters. So did he feel vulnerable?
Well, not so much, because that's not been the tradition. Look, family has always been, I mean, even beginning with Nehru to Morarji, family has always been around. So, the only problem in this case was that he was not officially married. But that apart, I don't think he was rather very open.
And he had a love child.
Yes.
And as you say, as she grew older, she began to look more and more like her father.
I mean, she was his daughter, yes.
You write that in the book.
Yes.
So every time people would have seen Mr. Vajpayee with Namita, the facial resemblance between the two would have been pretty obvious.
I mean, people knew about it. I'm sure. Did you not know about it? Tell me. Like, people knew about it.
But no one ever spoke about it publicly except behind closed doors. No one wrote about it. That's where your book has taken a significant step forward. That honesty is your credit.
Thank you. Thank you for that. But I don't think he worried too much about that, because
So he never felt vulnerable.
No, I mean, look, Vajpayee had a temperament. He could joke about it. He was asked about it, and he would, maybe he had already prepared inside his head. He would tackle it rather very carefully. Like, he would ask about private life. He would say, "Hi, bahut hi gambhir mamla hai." He would say something like that. And he was very, mind you, he was very clever and very shrewd.
Now, in your book, you write, Deen Dayal Upadhyay may not have approved of Atal's complicated private life, but you add Vajpayee was soon outgrowing his mentor. I take it this is an early indication of how he could be unconventional, how he could be bold and capable of being defiant.
Well, yes and no. Yes, because as it happens in any profession, Karan, mentees and superstar mentees tend to outgrow their mentors. And that might lead to some complication. It happens everywhere. It happens in cricket, cinema, media, everywhere. So that happened. Vajpayee became a celebrity after 57 and a national celebrity after he attacked Nehru on the China question. Deen Dayal Upadhyay remained a backroom man, but he remained the most respected person inside Janasangh. And because they went back a long time, they were both UP Brahmins, the families knew each other, they had lived together, traveled together, they had kind of...
But where did Vajpayee get the courage and the defiance to be able to stand up to Deen Dayal Upadhyay not approving of his private life?
I don't know if they ever had a discussion about it, but as I said, like, Janasangh people, look, they are more, these things are more fluid than you and I think. Now, Mohan Bhagwat's father, now let me introduce this, Madhukar Rao Bhagwat, he was when Gandhi was murdered, he was on hit list number 1 of, the police list that came up with. And he was the Gujarat Prant Pracharak. At some point, he decided to get married, and he had, 3 children. He had 4 children, and one of them is a Sangchalak now, is an RSS chief now. So I don't think anybody judges you that harshly for your private life. I mean, that is a bit of a myth. But with
this is in a sense where India is different to the West. In
Possibly,
the West,
yes.
this would have been a major story.
Oh, yes.
Newspapers would have fallen over each other to
yes.
expose it, and the Prime Minister of the day would have felt vulnerable. In India, the understanding and the conservative nature of our society
Yes.
has made it easier for Vajpayee.
Yes. I mean, in fact, in second volume, I write somewhere that people began to attack his health, his knees specifically, because they couldn't write about his private life because there were no takers for it. So what do you attack him next for? So that was the health. So
Tell me something. Is this...
Otherwise, Shastri was in a worse health, and Nehru towards the end was in far worse health than Vajpayee was in office.
And that wasn't revealed.
That wasn't revealed.
Tell
Nobody
me this,
talked about it.
As someone who's written a biography, and this is my last question on this subject before I move to other things that you revealed, because there's an awful lot else in your book that you revealed about Vajpayee, which is fascinating. But is this a good quality, or is it hypocrisy in India that we deliberately keep quiet about the private lives of people? I'm not talking about ordinary people. I'm talking about people who are foreign ministers and prime ministers, right? We do not reveal their private lives. We do not embarrass them. Is that a good quality in us? Or is that hypocrisy?
I mean, it's mostly a hypocrisy because that doesn't solve things. As I said, one of the reasons I mentioned this was to introduce an element of broad-mindedness, that more people know. It would be nice to know that, people in public life can have very complicated private lives because it's such a significant part of our lives.
And it's the truth.
It's the truth, yeah.
How can you write a biography of a man and hide the fact that for 30, 40 years he lived with another woman, had a love child from that woman, right? And therefore there was a certain amount of complication,
Right.
emotional and otherwise, in his life. How
I mean,
can you hide that?
I remember in 99, perhaps, Outlook did a cover story on the private life of people in power in India, 99, when he was in 7 RCR. And they also mentioned people from across party lines. Amazingly, the one name that was missing was the man who was the most important, that was Mr. Vajpayee.
This is the hypocrisy we're talking about.
Yes, and that was Outlook. I would have expected somebody like Vinod Mehta's publication to write about it. I don't know why they chose.
Okay, let's at this point come to some of the other aspects of Mr. Vajpayee's life, his character and his personality, which you reveal and which were not known until people picked up your book. The young Vajpayee, in fact, the words you use are the young Atal. You refer in your book to him as Atal. The young Atal, it seems, had an anti-Muslim side to him. On an article that he wrote for Rashtra Dharma, you say, and I'm quoting you, Atal argued that the Muslims who opted to live in India were to be seen as traitors.
Right.
Can you explain that further to me?
Right. So, okay, given his background, given where he came from, by background I mean his Arya Samaji background, RSS background, Hindu Mahasabha background, and the choices he made, that is in the summer of 1947, which was to become the editor of RSS mouthpieces, and they were just going to launch a Hindi mouthpiece in Lucknow. All of that indicates that he was a rabid Hindutva hardliner. He was not the Nehruvian that we often think of him, and the moderate that he later became. And the essay from which you quoted this, it's his first major publication. It's a long, rambling, very passionate, elliptical essay on the history of Islam in India. And he's very, very bitter. I mean, it's ultimately about partition, because this essay came out in August 1947.
But the important thing is what you said. He was a rabid communalist.
Well, yes, one could say that. But yes.
In fact, I want to quote from that essay, because you quote from that essay in your book. Muslims have only one motive, and that is to strengthen Pakistan. And then he adds, the Indian Muslims will act as fifth columnists.
That's what he thought in the summer of 1947, Karan. Yes.
So the young Atal
Yes.
was anti-Muslim
Yes.
and rabidly communalist.
Yes.
In all fairness, I should point out,
I mean, it's more complex. Look, summer of 47 was far more complex. There were major riots, unprecedented kind of displacement. So people were very emotionally very charged.
but it's at a moment of complexity and emotional charge
Right.
that you look to people for judgment, discretion and sense.
Right.
At that moment,
Right.
he was actually showing communalism, showing
Right.
dislike and hatred of Muslims.
Right, not just...
At the test,
Right.
he proved when he was young to be communalist.
Right.
In all fairness, I should point out that as an adult politician, Vajpayee's views seem to have changed fairly dramatically. Referring to Mahmud Ghazni, Muhammad Ghori and Aurangzeb, he wrote, and I'm quoting him, "No doubt the Vandals were Muslims, but they should not be considered representatives of Islam." And then he added, and perhaps this is even more important, "It is necessary for the rest of society not to hold the entire Muslim community answerable for the sins of these marauders." Now that's very different to considering Indian Muslims fifth columnists. So there was a dramatic change in Atal Vajpayee's attitude to Muslims as he grew older. But secondly, this view, don't regard Ghazni, Ghori and Aurangzeb as representative of Indian Muslims, is very different to the view of the government today. Mr. Vajpayee's essay that I'm now quoting speaks volumes to Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah.
Well, it's slightly more complicated, Karan, because, yes, obviously Vajpayee's views evolved significantly, and I would say in that sense he was far more evolved a personality than Mr. Modi or Mr. Shah, for sure. Having said that, Mr. Vajpayee also had so many U-turns, and lifelong U-turns, and I remember you interviewed him after the 1992 Babri demolition, and you said that, you've been described as a man who blows hot and cold, and that was the truth. So I would rephrase this slightly differently. What we could do is, let's think of what Vajpayee would have, how would he have behaved had he been a contemporary of Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah. Imagine if he was 30 years younger. That is an interesting question. Again, it's in some ways...
What's your answer?
Well, my answer would be that he would obviously not get the top job, because he was a bridge, and he would no longer be required as a bridge, because they have a majority of...
Would that mean that his views about Muslims would not have moderated? He would still be the hardliner, the communalist that he was when he was young?
No, I'm not saying that. It might have moderated, but I'm saying something else. I'm saying that, he would move between his dilemmas and double speak. He would continue to do that he did. By that I mean that he would take maybe couple of fat ministries. He would take MEA and maybe commerce or some such, and then stay quiet. He would grumble occasionally. You would hear something in the press that he's not happy. But he would not do anything in public. He would most certainly not resign the BJP. He would not join the other party, is what I'm trying to say.
But what impact would it have had on his views on Muslims? Because that's where the conversation grew out of. Had he been 30 years younger, would he have stayed the communist he was when he wrote the Rashtra Dharma?
No. I mean, by 60s and 70s, he was far more evolved, so he wouldn't have. But what I'm trying to say is, when politics demanded it, he would stay quiet, as it did later on so many occasions.
In other words, he was a man who knew what to say for the circumstances in which he was speaking.
Yes.
That sounds a bit like an opportunist. Well, or even hypocritical. He says what people want to hear.
Well, yeah, he would judge the atmosphere and then speak. I mean, you know perhaps better than I do how he behaved in the later decades.
But that's a very interesting thing you're saying. Because you're a biographer, you understand him well. He would judge the atmosphere and then decide what to say.
Yeah, I mean, see, it's slightly more complicated because he tried changing his party in the 80s. He tried really hard. But he saw that he failed miserably. And, he was kind of, he was rejected really badly for those 6-7 years. And then he realized that, I mean, what does one do if your views aren't accepted? So he fell in line. So one option would have been for him to retire, but full-time politicians in India don't want to do that.
But when again, you're saying it very importantly, when he realized that his views weren't accepted, he fell in line.
Right.
This is the hypocrisy or the opportunism.
I mean, that's what he did in the winter of 92 when you interviewed him. Yeah, and he had that guilty conscience because he tells you that, do you think I indulge in doublespeak? Which is what he was doing at that moment.
So he was capable of doublespeak.
Oh yes, most certainly.
And often did.
Yes.
That's something else that very few people acknowledge about him. Other biographies seem to present him as a man of principle. You actually say, and I think I'm saying this phrase correctly, he was a man of flexible principles.
Well, yes.
That's where the doublespeak.
He had some genuine dilemmas, but he also, indulged in cynical doublespeak on so many occasions. And let me. I want to add here something. I think some of it comes from the character, the gene of Sangh Parivar. Because clearly, if you look at the early decades, the founding parents, you look at Nehru, Patel, Syama Prasad Mukherjee and Ambedkar, they were very different people, all of them. They had very different politics, and yet I don't think any of them could afford to indulge in doublespeak or indulge in doublespeak.
Vajpayee could.
Vajpayee could, and so does Mr. Modi. So in that sense, despite so many differences, that's the similarity.
And this you link back to the genes of the RSS.
Yes, because they always wanted power, but they always wanted to hide. They didn't want to speak about it openly. So there was a lot of misinformation,
a lot of dikhava that was covering up the truth.
Yes.
Okay. You also reveal something very surprising, some would say something very disturbing, about what you think would have been Vajpayee's response to Gandhi's assassination. I'm quoting you. Atal most certainly did not consider Gandhi's death a serious loss to mankind.
Right.
And then you add, the dozens of articles he had written and edited, holding the Mahatma responsible for India's partition and condemning him for pandering to Muslims, had most certainly contributed to poisoning the air that ultimately led to Gandhi's assassination. If I read that correctly, there is a hint or suggestion here of an element of blame.
Well, yes. Indirectly, yes. Okay, so, I mean, if you remember why the RSS was banned in February, 2nd February 48, there were two elements. The first element was that they operated as private army, with which Mr. Vajpayee did not have anything directly to do. But the second charge, the more crucial charge, was that they created an environment in which anybody, because Mahatma was in Delhi, it would have been a Punjabi refugee, a Khatri refugee, there were so many desperate men walking all around who, an anguished man would have come and shot him dead.
RSS created an environment that made it possible for someone who was a refugee or who had a hatred of Gandhi to take that final step of killing Gandhi.
Yes, because he did not allow so much security. Yes.
And you're saying that the articles he wrote and edited contributed to that atmosphere.
Yes, most certainly, yes.
Vajpayee contributed through his writing and his editing to the atmosphere that is responsible for the assassination of Gandhi.
Well, not just Vajpayee, he was part of the team. I mean, so in that sense, collective blame, most certainly, yes. And which is why
he's part of that collective blame.
Yes, of course.
And as editor of RSS magazine, he has a fairly important role in it.
Yes.
Because he was writing the articles and also editing articles.
Yes.
By editing, I mean editor of magazines.
Yes. I mean, they were so obscure that in all probability, he wrote most of the articles.
This is something no one has ever said of Vajpayee before. that he shares an element of blame for creating the atmosphere
Right.
within which Gandhi's assassination became possible.
Well, Home Ministry said that, and I mean,
But not of Vajpayee. You're the first person who said it of Vajpayee. Again, this is something very new in your book.
I mean, look, no, it's not exactly my fault, but I mean, in some way, it's rather common sense. That's why RSS was banned, and he was the editor. And in my book, I have also given this is a cartoon in which they're mocking Gandhi's fast, Panchjanya, in the second issue.
But can I point this out?
Right.
Both what you said about how Vajpayee contributed to the atmosphere that's responsible for Gandhi's assassination, and also because of the way you've confirmed and revealed details of his adulterous relationship with Rajkumari Kaul, the love child he had, and the threesome that they had, the RSS and in particular the BJP will be pretty angry with you.
With me? Well, look, I like to think I did an honest job. And honestly, there was no other way of writing a book other than to be blunt and honest. But I mean, if they read it correctly, they would also be happy on certain matters. Because for the first time, I reveal with lots of new documents why Patel loved them so much.
Absolutely. That is true, but that's for another day and another subject. But Vajpayee is an icon for them.
Right.
And you've shown that their icon had questions around him.
Well, sir,
both in terms of his doublespeak and hypocrisy, but also in terms of his private life. And these are things that may have been known, but they've never been made public. And when you make them public, you make them accessible to people. So are you worried about the response from Amit Shah, Narendra Modi, BJP spokesman, JP Nadda? Are you worried that they will descend on you? Like a
I hope not. I hope that they'll take it in right spirit, because it is one of, I mean, at the risk of sounding conceited, I like to think that it is one of the first serious and unbiased studies of Hindu right. So I hope they learn from it rather than.
And more importantly, the job of a biographer is to be honest, and you've been honest.
Right. And
if they don't like the honesty, that's their problem, not yours.
Right. And I hope it helps them understand their inner lives better.
Okay. I deliberately brought up that question at this point about the BJP response because I thought it will occur to the audience, and let me raise it. Let's go back to some of the other revelations and exposes about Vajpayee, which are fascinating and were not known before. For instance, we all think of Vajpayee as a great opponent of the emergency, and indeed in the speeches that he made when the elections of 77 happened, he was the star speaker.
Right.
But you revealed that during the emergency there was an incident when Vajpayee had tried to convince Jayaprakash Narayan to compromise with Indira Gandhi.
That's right.
Tell me more about that, because that's new.
Right. I mean, Karan, one has to understand the situation in early 76. So, the Lok Sabha election was due in 76 because after 71 it was supposed to be in 76. That was postponed, so everybody got scared. Then, far worse, there came a Supreme Court judgment, or rather perhaps one of the most shameful judgments ever by Supreme Court, which said that, in times of emergency, the government has the right to curtail even fundamental rights.
ADM Jabalpur.
Yes. Yes. And so all the habeas corpus, all the petitions were cancelled, and everybody we thought we were going the Pakistan way, we thought we were going the Bangladesh way, and that dictatorship, it was the beginning of a dictatorship, we would never again have an election. And Sangh Parivar being who they are, so the maximum number of people, under arrest, under MISA, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, were from Sangh Parivar, between Jan Sangh, and there are all kinds of cadres, the AVVP and others. And at least a dozen odd people had died in jail, including some of Mr. Vajpayee.
So did Vajpayee take fright?
No, I'm just coming to that. So there was a lot of pressure from their families for a compromise. And also, look, I mean, what we don't know enough is that lots of people were happy to compromise, what they used to call sign a surrender document. I don't know the truth about that, but they were certainly happy to compromise, including Charan Singh's party, including some socialists. So in 76, there was already some kind of this talk about let's kind of see and try and negotiate with the government. And it was in that environment, there was pressure was building up on Mr. Vajpayee from Sangh Parivar people, and he asked JP that there was right before emergency they had formed something called LSS, Lok Sangharsh Samiti, and government thought they were creating mischief during the emergency, and it told JP कि देखिए ये आपके नाम में है ये जो लोक संघर्ष समिति है आप ही वापस ले सकते हैं, and only then government would be convinced. So if it's not working.
So Vajpayee's motivation
Yeah.
in asking Jayaprakash Narayan to compromise with Indira Gandhi was that he was worried about the people from the RSS getting arrested. As you say, a disproportionate number of RSS people were arrested under MISA, and he was worried about their families and their safety.
Right.
And that's why, rather than stand up like a bulwark for democracy, he said, it might be easier to compromise and
Oh,
get
by
out of
that,
this.
Karan, by that time, they were happy to, they were negotiating with the government. And the very fact that Vajpayee was meeting JP, I mean, during an emergency, it must have been facilitated by the government. So they were part of the larger negotiation. Of course, it did not work out because JP said, why don't you do something?
So during those days when he was meeting JP, he was being facilitated by Mrs. Gandhi to meet JP.
Not just Mr. Vajpayee, many opposition leaders.
You also suggest in a book that when the 1977 elections were announced by Mrs. Gandhi, which took everyone by surprise, Vajpayee's initial response, you call it a knee-jerk response, was let's not contest them.
Right.
Why was he worried that they might lose?
Yeah, I mean, he was worried that something that it might be fixed, it might be rigged, and that.
He didn't realize actually that the mood on the ground of the Indian people would have guaranteed a huge victory. He was unaware of that.
Yeah, he was unaware of that, and also because there was no way Karan to find out, because in the last 1.5 years, nobody protested, and even the media. I have written about India Today's response. The media was also supporting the government, so media was as sycophantic. I mean, if back then there was.
You write explicitly about India Today, which was a very new magazine at the time,
right,
which was extremely sycophantic, as you point out.
Right.
Right. Today, India Today presents itself as a great bulwark of democracy, but when it started in 75, 76, it was sycophantic in the extreme.
I have simply reported a quote, and it says they mocked the opposition. It was such a wild thing to do.
About Vajpayee is we look back upon him as someone who was an opponent of the emergency, but actually when you look at the details, there were moments when he wanted to compromise.
Right.
He was hesitant to contest the elections. He didn't realize that the mood of the people would guarantee a sweeping victory. He didn't quite have his finger on the pulse at that moment of the time.
He didn't have.
Now, there is one story about Vajpayee that is widely believed. And it's that on the 16th of December 1971, when Pakistan surrendered and Bangladesh was born,
right,
Vajpayee called Indira Durga. You puncture that story. You write, in actual fact, that evening, he was missing from Parliament. He was either travelling or indisposed. So it's not true that he ever called Indira Gandhi Durga.
Not at all. Well, in fact, the next morning, he was arguing the opposite. The next morning, he landed up in Parliament and he argued that we should not have an unconditional ceasefire. I'll just come to what his calculations were, but he was like, let's continue the war in the western sector. Let's try and get POK. So that was his calculation, and he was one of the few people who argued that. Also, 2 days later, that is 19 December, there was a joint session of Parliament, which was basically to felicitate Mrs. Gandhi and Jagjeevan Ram, who was the defense minister. Mr. Vajpayee missed even that, but that was all strategic because Jansangh was in a dilemma. They had egged on the government to fight the war, but they knew in 71, for the first time, the Lok Sabha and Assembly elections were fought separately, and the government was going to announce Assembly elections to 16
and he
states.
was terribly scared that the government would sweep the Assembly elections.
Oh yes, because they thought he did the same after Kargil.
But the important point is this. Everyone has believed that by calling her Durga in Parliament, it was proof of what a large-hearted man he was. He could praise in the highest terms his opponent.
Right.
Actually, he did nothing of the sort.
Well, he did on some occasions, Karan, and also,
but Durga he didn't say.
He didn't say Durga, but he did praise her. The point is, he did praise her.
But the Durga thing on the 16th of December
that is a myth.
That is a myth.
There's
another story which this time you don't puncture, but you certainly put it in perspective. It's the belief that Jawaharlal Nehru always admired Vajpayee and identified him very early as a future Prime Minister. That may or may not be true. Most people believe it's true. But what you reveal, and this is very important because it wasn't known to anyone, is that in Vajpayee's early years as an MP, Nehru thought of him as, and I'm quoting, a highly objectionable person.
Right.
Can you explain that?
Right. Okay. First of all, it's a total myth, Karan, that Nehru ever referred to him as a future Prime Minister. I think it's a piece of misinformation that we should discard outright. Nehru...
So that is a myth.
Totally, yes. That's a falsehood. Yes. Let me just...
But it's widely believed.
Give me a moment to explain it. No, Nehru never said it. Nehru never spoke about it. Vajpayee himself, there's no evidence of either of them ever speaking about it. There are no papers that ever talk about it. There are no newspapers that ever talk about it. In fact, even RSS mouthpieces, which were so obscure in the late 50s and early 60s, that they would report something as minor as Jansangh protesting outside Teen Murti and Vajpayee, handing over some memorandum to Nehru. That would become the cover story. Nehru saying something as grand as, he's going to be the future Prime Minister, they would have carried it on cover story for 10 weeks, Karan. So that didn't happen. Okay. Also think of it from Nehru's point of view. Nehru kind of liked Vajpayee and thought of him as a nice guy in an otherwise very regressive party. But why would Nehru, who was desperately wanting to ban Sangh Parivar, why would he want to have a government by Sangh Parivar? It would in fact be his worst nightmare, I would say. So I don't think, what might have happened is you start hearing these things only in the 90s actually. You never heard these things before the 90s.
So these are concoctions?
Most, like 99.9% chances that yes, because there's no evidence at all.
Okay.
But
what about that point? When Vajpayee was an early MP, and this is a point you make in your book, that Nehru thought of him as a highly objectionable person.
Right, Nehru never liked this stand on Kashmir, and what happens was, see, apart from going to Jammu or some areas in the valley and roughing Hindus there, so apart from, complicating the situation in the only Muslim majority state, it also often had diplomatic repercussions, because Pakistan would often quote what RSS was doing or what Jansangh was doing, and Nehru was very touchy about those things. And right from 47, like always, Pakistan always, they would keep a watch.
In fact, you point out in your book that Nehru contacted the then Cabinet Secretary Vishnu Sai to say Vajpayee should not be allowed to go to Srinagar.
Right, he did. So, so it's a myth that, they were great friends. They eventually they kind of mellowed down, and and at some point they also allowed to use each other in some ways.
But the point you're making is that it is a myth that Nehru admired Vajpayee hugely. It's a lie that Nehru identified him as an early Prime Minister. In fact, the truth is that Vajpayee's early career as an MP, Nehru thought he was, and I'm quoting again, a highly objectionable person.
Right. I have quoted their first meeting. It was, Nehru basically, first Vajpayee sniped into Nehru's policy the very first time they met. And then Nehru responded, and he was very stung. The next day he said, "Ye bajaru kism ke naye netaji aaye hain."
बाजारू किस्म के नेताजी.
I have written about it, yeah. कि इनके विचार थोड़े बाजारू मालूम होते हैं. इनको लग रहा है कि लोकसभा भी चुनाव का मैदान है. Something like that.
Now your book also punctures some of the very careful spinning done by the BJP to build up Vajpayee's image. For instance, Panchjanya claimed the biggest proof of his talent is that all through his student life he never stood second.
Right.
In complete contrast, you write, Atal himself did not radiate academic excellence.
That's right.
You also point out the claim that Vajpayee is a LLB degree holder is completely untrue. He actually abandoned his law degree.
Right. Vajpayee, I did not know, and I was surprised and amused that Vajpayee was academically never all that bright. He was writing poems, he had a sense of meter and rhyming, but due to whatever reasons, maybe he didn't take academics seriously. He was not all that bright, so I discovered that he got a 3rd division in 8th standard, 2nd division in 10th standard, and again a 3rd division in MA. So I think what must have happened, my guess is that, and I have written about it, is that when he first fought the election, because he was so young, and even though he was indeed very, very bright, he was fighting alongside the veterans. So I thought, my guess is that Jansangh, to people in his party, it must have appeared that if we want to put them on equal footing, we have to, improve.
So they manufactured stories about his academic excellence.
Yeah, so there was a lot of mirch masala, and so they said that he was an academic prodigy, or that, his role in 1942, they said, he was a great revolutionary. So all of those exaggerations, and, it kept on piling up with every election, some more misinformation, some more mirch masala.
But all untrue.
Some of them untrue, yes. Look, he was a bright man, there's no doubt about it. But it kept piling up so high that at some point, it had to be demolished someday. And when it was demolished by Bliss earlier, and also in 98 by Frontline, it was embarrassing for Mr. Vajpayee.
Now, in one important respect, your book also demolishes the false claims that Congress has made about Vajpayee. Congress seems to often insist that Vajpayee had no role to play whatsoever in the independence movement. You write, I'm quoting you, Vajpayee had indeed participated in the Quit India protests in Gwalior. You also say that the insinuation spread by Blitz several decades earlier that Vajpayee is a British informer is factually incorrect.
Right.
Tell me, what was Vajpayee's role in the Quit India movement?
Okay, it's a long story, I'll cut it short. Basically, after Gandhiji announced, declared this Quit India movement in August 42, Sindhyas were friends of the British, and they came out with a notification saying nobody will participate in this. Jivaji Sindhya was a young man, and the British were slightly skeptical. They thought he was a guy who was only interested in his horses, and he was not a good administrator. So he was very keen to prove that he was a good administrator, and he was trying hard. So when during this phase, this thing happened, and Mr. Vajpayee was one of the people who actually defied that ban in Gwalior. So the Darbar came up with a list of 68 people who had participated, 68 students who had participated. So that was certainly an act of bravery, I would say, both Vajpayee and his elder brother, Prem Bihari Vajpayee. But that created a problem for his father, who was just about to retire, and he had unmarried daughters. So he was worried, because he was unofficially, conveyed the matter that your sons are making mischief. So he just sent them off to their native village, and there he casually participated in breaking the forest law. He was not a main actor there, and then he was sent off to jail. And when he was, father came to meet him and said, "You will have to."
So Vajpayee also spent time in jail during the Quit India movement.
Right.
So on both those counts,
Right.
A, Vajpayee didn't participate, and B, he didn't go to jail. On both those counts, Congress is wrong.
Right, they're wrong, of course. At the same time, I must add that Vajpayee's CV, as he would later claim, that he went to his village and he was a revolutionary and he organized all those sabotaging.
That was exaggerated.
Exaggeration. Yes, that was an exaggeration.
So the problem is the BJP and perhaps Vajpayee himself exaggerated the role that he played.
Yes.
But it's also untrue to say he played no role at all.
Yes,
So
that's right.
you've corrected the Congress myth
Yes.
that Vajpayee played no role, but you've also corrected the BJP claim
Right.
that he had a major role to play.
Right.
But as a student, he did defy the Darbar, that is the house of Gwalior in Scindia,
Right.
and actually participate, and he was part of that
Right.
list of 68.
Right. And he was admonished, because Darbar came up with a list. I have mentioned that document of list of students from his schools and colleges who did that. And it must have been tough on their parents, because they were mostly Scindia employees.
Now, yours, as I said, is a very well-rounded portrait of Vajpayee, and it reveals that in many ways he was a bon vivant. You write, he had a fondness for bhang, he drank in moderate quantities, he had a lifelong gluttony for Chinese food, and a few times in New York, accompanied, it seems, by Maharaj Krishna Rasgotra, who was a young diplomat in New York at the time, Vajpayee went to nightclubs.
Right.
And on such informal occasions, you say, he drank a peg or two.
Right.
He liked the good things of life.
Oh yes, he did. Well, he did. I mean, early Vajpayee was slightly prudish, living among pracharaks who lived in really bad conditions, eating bad food, and cubicles in Lucknow. So he was prudish, living a life of emotional and sexual repression in Lucknow, and which is why, in early chapters I have mentioned that he said, minors should not be allowed to watch films. They should not be allowed even to listen to music. But as he traveled, as his worldview widened, yes, he became interested in good things, good food, good music, good art, good cinema. And apart from all that you've said, I remember that in '93, when Suitable Boy came out, that novel, he was one of the few politicians to actually finish the novel, which is, I must say, is a bit of an achievement, because a fat novel, 1,300-page novel, and you don't expect a politician to, do something like that. Also, a few weeks before he had this stroke in 2007, he inaugurated an art exhibition. So yeah, I mean, all these tastes, they were evolving, and yeah, with time.
We're coming to the end of this interview, but I want to end by asking you a question about how you personally view Vajpayee. Your book, and I'm holding it up again, your book reveals things about Vajpayee that were not known and could not have been even guessed at. At the same time, you've also demolished myths about Vajpayee, which people have accepted as gospel truth. You've shown them to be completely false. So I'm going to end by asking you this. Do you like the man that emerges from your book?
That's tough to answer, Karan. Can I answer it my own way?
Of course.
in my preface, Karan, in my preface, I have written that my book is a book of assessment. It's not a book of tribute. But I can tell you that when he passed away, okay, some of it was journalistic curiosity, but I did stand up in a queue outside his house at 1 a.m. in night, and at around 2 a.m. I did go and did my pranams and pay my tributes. But then again, it won't change the way I write about him.
So what's the answer? You admired him, I presume, which is why you stood outside his house when he died at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Well, I thought it was my way of paying a small tribute to a man who had been so crucial to India. Yes, but I also knew that I might not be, I would probably be slightly harsh to him. So maybe to compensate for that tribute would be a bit of a compensation. But yeah, otherwise, yes, he does have a slightly checkered legacy. Yeah. I like shades of Vajpayee. I like his detachment. I like his moderation, and some occasions, at least in the 80s, he tried very hard to bring BJP away from the hardliner line. But he failed and then he fell in line. So,
So
yes,
if I understand what you're saying correctly, there are things about Vajpayee you liked.
yes,
There are others that you didn't admire.
yes, right.
Right?
Right.
You don't have a clear, simple answer. I like him or dislike him. It's bits and pieces.
Can't be, Karan. If you write on Nehru or Patel, you would also wouldn't have, perhaps. Yeah.
Abhishek Chaudhary, thank you very much indeed. Let me once again hold up this book. This is an extremely honest biography of a very complicated politician who we all thought we knew, but when you read this book, you suddenly discover we probably didn't fully understand either the man or the politician. Therefore, I suggest if Vajpayee interests you, this is a book you must read.
Thank you, Karan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.